Imagine for a moment, at the dawn of the 19th century, the echoes of thousands of horses' hooves on the dusty roads of Europe, the gunpowder smoke covering the sky, and an entire continent shaped by the will of a single man. Napoleon Bonaparte, as one of the most ambitious commanders history has ever seen, set his sights on the vast steppes of the East while running from victory to victory. Yet in those moments, in the depths of Russia, neither the sound of cannons nor the clashing of swords could be heard. There was only the whisper of the wind and a looming, freezing silence. This silence was the harbinger of General Winter, who would swallow one of the greatest armies in history. I tell you honestly, in preparing this video, I felt to my core the final breaths of thousands of soldiers left under the snow, Napoleon's desperate gazes, and that relentless cold that changed the course of history. On this channel, I read sources for days for every story, examine academic documents, and take notes. I try to transform all of them into a simple, fluent, and relaxing language for you. Because these moments of history deserve the attention they receive. If this effort feels valuable to you, leave a small comment under the video. I am truly curious about what you think. Click the like button once. This small gesture allows these contents to reach more people. And if you are not yet a subscriber, now is the time. This journey is just beginning. When June of 1812 arrived, Napoleon had reached the Russian border with more than 600,000 soldiers, whom he called the Grande Armée. This massive force, advancing under the scorching sun, was gathered from every corner of Europe and possessed a discipline that had never tasted defeat before. The French emperor dreamed of winning a quick victory and bringing Tsar Alexander to the peace table in a short time. However, the endless depth of the Russian lands lay before the army like a giant labyrinth. The Russians preferred to retreat and leave nothing behind, instead of clashing with Napoleon in a pitched battle. What did this strategy mean? This method, called the scorched-earth tactic, meant that every village, every field, and every granary the French army advanced through was turned to ash. Napoleon's soldiers entered emptied towns but could not find even a single crumb of bread to eat. As the hot summer months slowly gave way to a melancholy autumn, the discipline of the army began to shake along with hunger. Horses were perishing, logistics lines were breaking, and the depths of Russia were slowly swallowing this giant army. Right at that point, the relentless power of nature would become much more effective than man-made weapons. By mid-September, the air still held a deceptive warmth. When Napoleon reached the gates of Moscow, he had already left half of his army behind on the roads. While the Battle of Borodino was recorded as one of the bloodiest days in history, the French soldiers believed they had secured a victory. In reality, this was merely the beginning of a giant trap being set deep within Russia. When the emperor entered the city on his white horse, he expected to find a delegation waiting to greet him. Instead, the streets of the city were completely empty, and only the howling of the wind could be heard. What was this silence a harbinger of? Moscow was the heart of the Russian soul, and the Russians were prepared to burn this heart rather than surrender it to Napoleon. As midnight arrived, flames began to rise from different points across the city. Wooden houses, narrow streets, and palaces fell one by one into the grip of fire. As Napoleon watched the city from the window of the Kremlin Palace, he saw with horror how the crimson flames covered the sky with a white smoke. The city burned for days, and all the supply depots where the French army had planned to spend the winter turned to ash. Right at that point, Napoleon's arrogance prevented him from seeing the truth. The emperor sat among the ashes of Moscow for 35 days, waiting for a peace letter from Tsar Alexander. Time was working against the French, for nature was quietly preparing its own army. Russia's famous cold had not yet shown itself, but the clouds were slowly growing heavy. The Tsar gave no response to Napoleon's letters. This silence was actually the signal given for Russia's most loyal general, General Winter, to launch the assault. By the end of October, the first snowflakes began to fall slowly to the ground like feathers. When Napoleon finally realized that the peace he expected would not come, he gave the order to retreat. However, this decision was made too late. As the army set out with thousands of wounded and wagons full of loot, the sky closed in completely. Temperatures dropped below zero in a single night. French soldiers were still trying to withstand this freezing wind in their summer uniforms. Both sides of the road began to fill with the lifeless bodies of exhausted soldiers who had frozen to death. To understand this, one must feel the desperation of that moment. Hunger on one side, and that relentless cold that cut through skin like a knife on the other. Horses collapsed one by one because they could not find food, and soldiers were forced to slaughter their own mounts to survive. Discipline gave way to the instinct for survival. Russian peasants and Cossack riders followed this weakening giant army like a shadow, attacking from behind at every opportunity. Napoleon, the master of Europe, was now like a refugee trying to find his way through the snow. When the first week of November passed, the sky had already settled over the army like a gray shroud. While the famous frost of Russia seeped into the bones of the French soldiers, the sound of the wind resembled the howling of a hungry wolf. As Napoleon moved silently on his horse, he looked at the trembling hands and bruised faces of the soldiers around him. These people were no longer the proud warriors who had sung victory marches in the most brilliant squares of Europe just months ago. Now, they had become ghostly silhouettes, ready to sell their souls to the devil just to take the next step. Was there an end to this misery? The army retreating toward the Smolensk road was shaken by the harsher blows of General Winter at every step. The snow depth reached knee-height. Frozen roads caused horses to slip and break their legs. The fall of a horse meant both a tragedy and a terrifying feast for the army. For the soldiers, maddened by hunger, grabbed their knives while the animal was still struggling, trying to tear off pieces of raw meat with their frozen fingers. This scene was that dark point where humanity ended and only a savage survival war began. When night fell, the situation became even more horrifying. To keep warm, soldiers huddled around the feeble fires they lit, praying that white death would not catch them in their sleep. Yet, when the sun rose in the morning, many of those soldiers who had formed a circle around the fires remained motionless, like frozen statues. Those who had to leave their friends there in the snow and continue on their way knew that their own end was also approaching. Death was no longer seen as a feared end, but as the shortest way to escape the agony. To understand this, visualize the conditions of that time. They wore only thin fabrics. On their feet were boots riddled with holes. Soldiers whose toes turned black from frostbite rubbed them with snow to ease the pain, but this effort often did nothing but accelerate the spread of gangrene. Although Napoleon, in the midst of his imperial guard, still tried to maintain a sense of order, absolute chaos reigned throughout the army in general. The Russians, with great patience, watched nature finish off this giant army. They only emerged from ambushes to hunt down the exhausted units. Indeed, the true master of Russia was not man, but this freezing and merciless climate itself. By the middle of November, the biting wind gave way to a terrifying blizzard. Visibility dropped to nothing. Soldiers lost in the vast expanse of white drifted away from the main body of the army, disappearing into the dark forests forever. As Napoleon looked at his army melting away day by day, he knew the maps in his hands no longer held any meaning. The distances between cities were not shrinking. On the contrary, due to hunger and exhaustion, every kilometer was turning into an impassable mountain range. The once magnificent banners of the empire were now nothing more than dirty rags dragged across the snow. Why were the Russians still not launching a major assault? The Tsar's generals understood that the winter would hunt down the French army one by one. Therefore, they were content with merely harassing the retreating line. Cossack riders emerged from the blizzard like ghosts, cutting down the exhausted rear guards and vanishing back into the whiteness. For the French soldiers, the greatest enemy was no longer just the cold, but these invisible attackers who could strike from anywhere at any moment. Fear and uncertainty weighed heavily upon their physical pain, imprisoning the minds of the soldiers in darkness. Right at that point, one of the most sorrowful and bloody scenes in history, the crossing of the Berezina River, loomed ahead. When the army reached the riverbank, they saw the icy waters flowing rapidly and the bridges destroyed by the Russians. Napoleon ordered his engineers to build a new bridge at any cost. French engineers entered the ice-cold water up to their necks, resisting the freezing current for hours. Most of these men died of hypothermia shortly after completing the bridge. While their sacrifice offered a small glimmer of hope to the rest of the army, the other side of the river still opened into absolute uncertainty. To understand this, you must imagine that place of judgment on the riverbank. Thousands of people, horse-drawn wagons, and the wounded crushed each other to cross the narrow bridge. Russian cannons began to vomit fire upon this crowd from the other side of the river. Cannonballs shattered the ice. Hundreds of soldiers sank into the cold waters, fading into eternity. As the waters of the river were stained crimson that day, General Winter silently buried his victims in an icy grave. When Napoleon crossed to the opposite bank, he looked back and saw that nothing but a shattered wreck remained of the Grande Armée. Indeed, the price of ambition was being paid with the lives of thousands of innocent people. As December approached, the freezing winds blowing from the depths of Russia sharpened like daggers. Although Napoleon had left the bloody waters of the Berezina behind, he knew that salvation was still very far away. The handful of soldiers remaining were no longer an army, but a procession of the walking dead. With feet wrapped in rags and faces covered in soot and sorrow, these men were the tragic remnants of the Grande Armée that had once made the world tremble. As the emperor traveled silently through the snow under the protection of his loyal guards, he perhaps felt the weight of absolute defeat on his shoulders for the first time. Was the cold the only one responsible for this massive destruction? Undeniably no. For the errors in Napoleon's logistical calculations were the greatest factor strengthening the hand of General Winter. When the horses died one by one because they could not find food, cannons, ammunition wagons, and medical supplies had to be abandoned among the snow. This situation completely destroyed the defensive power of the army, leaving them at the mercy of the Russian Cossacks. Behind every hill, in every forest corner, the Russians lay in ambush, waiting only for the right moment to hunt the exhausted French. The smoke rising along the escape route showed that every abandoned town and every barn that served as a last refuge for the soldiers was being set on fire. Right at that point, Napoleon had to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life. When he received news of a coup attempt against him in Paris, he decided to leave his army in the hands of his generals and head ahead secretly in a sleigh. The emperor's departure, leaving his army in the middle of the snow, caused a total psychological collapse in the remaining soldiers. For the soldiers who saw that even their commanders had abandoned them, there was now only one goal: to survive just one more day. The roads were filled with abandoned gold, expensive paintings, and jewels looted from Moscow, but no one even looked at these treasures. Because in that freezing cold, a piece of dry bread or a sip of hot water was more precious than all the treasures in the world. To understand this, think of the desperation of a person who does not even have a roof to shelter under during the harshest days of winter. The scene that emerged when the blizzard subsided consisted of hundreds of thousands of lifeless bodies frozen in the middle of a white desert. Napoleon had entered Russia with more than 600,000 soldiers, but when he reached the Polish border, only a few tens of thousands exhausted men remained with him. This was one of the greatest military tragedies history had ever seen, and General Winter had buried Napoleon's legend of invincibility forever in those vast steppes of Russia. Indeed, man's desire to dominate nature had once again knelt before the cold and silent will of the elements. Sinairi Jekmai ve Polonia il Prussia Toperclarina Ulasmai Besaran Sanslia Zinlik, Ruzia Ovalari Kater Ruhu Sarsan ber Manzarela Karsalasti. Yerel Halk, ber Zaman Lar of Rupanin Effendisai Olarak Gordaclari Mutism Ordi Urin, Yuzlari Yanmis ve Tanin Mayakak Kater Zayaflamis, Pakavralar I Sindiki Hail at Lagordu. Buaskurlarin Goslarind, Yasidaklari Desitin Islari Oldugu Kater Darin ber Heil Kirikliji Devardi. Napoleon Parisi Ulaser Ulazmaz Yeni ber Ordu Kermak Isen Heman Kalasmalara Baslamis Ulsada, Ruzinin Karlarinda Geride Baraktijai se Sadis Insan Guku de Gildi. Jersek Gukunu, Yenel Meslik Havasini O Bay as Karanlikta Kabet Misti. Bu Bayak Yenel Jinin of Rupa Userindiki Etkasai Nadi. Napoleonan Ruzida Diskakmizi, O Zamana Kater Franzis Baskisi Altinda Yasayan Tum Uluslar Isen ber Caesaret Kavilsami Kakti. Prussia, of Austria ve Digger Coalition Gucklary, Devon General Winter Terrafinden Yeralandagini ve Savunlases Byrakildagini Gormaslurdi. Simdi Napoleon, Sadis Duzenli Orjalarla Dejel, Intikam Susas Lugula Dalu ber Katela Karsi Karsiati. Ruzia Seferi, Napoleon Imperatorlaganan Kokasun Yal Akan En Bayak Ven Malietli Hata Olarak Terahin Tazlu Sefalarina Kazindi. Kunku Askari Diha Daganin Kanan Larini Gormesden Geldajind, Zafer Kasanilmas Olarak Felakit Donasur. Tamo Noctada, General Kisin Basarisi Dunya Askari Teri Kitaplarinda Ber Durs Olarak Agratilmai Baslandi. Bu Zafer Sadis Ber Donum Noctasi de Gildi. Rus Hawkanen Kendi Toperclarini Savunma by Simonin ve Dusmani Kendi Kografiasinda Bogma Strategizanen Ber Sonakaidu. Duzmanlarini Yenmek Isen Bayak Maiden Savaslarina Gurmekurin, Ruslar Onlari Daganan Asimazais Colorina Teslim et Mislurdi. Napoleon, Jerry Sekularkan Jektiji her Yal ve Kabatiji her Askurla Slinda Kendi Sununa Dogru Uraduganu Biliordu. Muscovani Natisai Sandral Mustu, Ankak o Atesh Yanmis ve Napoleonan of Rupa Userindiki Hakamayatini de Kul Severmisti. Bunu Anlamak Isen, Terahin Bu Anini Sadis Bersavas Olarak Dejel, Kibir Dersi Olarak de Gormalias. Ruzia Seferi, Logistiktan Yaksan ve Dogul Kosalari Hasaba Katmayan Berplanin Ne Kater Kirilgan Oldugunu Tum Dunya Kanatladi. Napoleon, Ruzianin Soguk Boskarlarinda Sadis Bersavas Dejel, Jelasejani de Geride Berakmisti. Yiler Sanra, Sagundikan Bile, O Donduruku Rusgarin Sassini ve Karda Kabolan Askerlaranin Sigliclarini Duadugu Soilanir. Boilis, Kis Generali, Terahin Akasini Degistaran Gorames Kamutan ve Ruzianin en Sadik Koryukusu Olarak Sansuza Dek Haderlamea Devam e Dissector. Months after the Russian campaign, stories of that horrific winter were still being told across every corner of Europe. Although Napoleon mobilized all his resources to raise a new army, it was impossible to replace the experienced cavalry and those massive artillery batteries he had lost. General Winter had frozen not just the bodies of the French army, but its soul. The veterans who managed to survive that white depth felt themselves pulled back into that bottomless darkness whenever the wind increased or the first snowflake touched the ground. This turned into one of the greatest social traumas history has ever seen, a legend of sorrow to be told for generations. What changed in Napoleon's personal world after this defeat? The emperor, who saw himself as a man of destiny controlling the flow of history, understood for the first time how helpless he was against nature and coincidence. He viewed the world as a chessboard and built all his moves on logic. However, General Winter had shown him in the most painful way that no rational plan could cope with the reality of -40 degrees. Napoleon's famous gray overcoat was no longer a symbol of victory, but of a struggle for survival in the snow. The traces of those cold nights and the cries by the riverbank would never be erased from the emperor's mind. At that very point, this victory for Russia was not just a defensive success, it was the birth of a national identity. By turning the harshness of their land and the cruelty of their climate into weapons, the Russian people had brought Europe's greatest military power to its knees. This achievement left deep marks in everything from Russian literature to music. From Tolstoy's massive works to Tchaikovsky's overtures, it was possible to hear the footsteps of General Winter everywhere. The French army had not just left destruction behind as they retreated. They also announced to the whole world the image of Russia as an invincible power. To understand this, one must look at this turning point of history from a broad perspective. If that winter had not been so harsh, or if Napoleon had planned his logistical preparations for just one more month, we might be living in a very different Europe today. However, history does not walk on ifs, but on lived experiences. General Winter appeared on the stage like a divine force interfering with the flow of history and buried Napoleon's pride in the frozen rivers of Russia. Indeed, even the most brilliant minds and the most powerful armies are merely temporary guests in the face of the ancient and silent power of nature. Napoleon's Russian campaign will remain not just as a military defeat in the dusty shelves of history, but as the most dramatic stage where human ambition and the absolute power of nature collided. Today, when looking at those vast steppes, one can still feel the wind carrying the whispers of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Although General Winter never held a rank or wore a medal, he will be remembered as the only commander who changed the course of history with a single cold breath. Napoleon's great dream under the snow is the whitest and coldest proof of how fragile ambition and pride are against the ancient balance of nature. I tell you honestly, telling history accurately is much harder than telling it beautifully. For every video on this channel, I read sources for days, examine academic documents, and take notes. I try to transform all of them into a simple, fluent, and relaxing language for you. Because these moments of history deserve the attention they receive. If this effort feels valuable to you, leave a small comment under the video. I am truly curious about what you think. Click the like button once. This small gesture allows these contents to reach more people. And if you are not yet a subscriber, now is the time. This journey is just beginning. What is the greatest lesson left to us from this story? Perhaps it is to never forget that even in the moments we think we are strongest, the world and nature around us have a much larger plan than ours. Although Napoleon founded one of the greatest empires in history, he did not account for the weight of a single snowflake. Yet history is sometimes shaped not by the greatest armies, but in the shadow of the smallest natural events. This white epic written by General Winter will continue to whisper that no matter how far humanity goes with technology and power, it must always respect the silent and deep will of nature. To understand this, look at the darkness outside your window on a cold winter night and feel the power within that silence. Once, that silence swallowed an entire empire. We will continue to explore such mysterious and staggering moments of history together. Thank you for being with me on this journey and for breathing this deep story with me. Until we meet again at another turning point of history, with the same calmness and depth. Stay safe, stay in the light of history.